Okay, folks, so in the second set of slides, let's take a look at two other theories that may explain criminality. We talked before about social structural theories that argue that criminality is a result of conditions in the social structure that affect people's choice making. We have two different theories here today that talk about other things that affect choice making. The first one is social learning theory, and this is a very popular theory that is used to explain a lot of delinquency, where it is argued that criminal behavior is learned through social interaction. One aspect of that is differential association. That is, we tend to differentially associate with people who are like us or with people who give us something in return for our participation in the group, whether it's a boost to our self-esteem, whether it's a sense of belonging, whether it maybe is a way, for example, to gain credibility or legitimacy. So for social learning theory, criminality is a byproduct of interacting with others. So the outcomes are perceived by important members of the group. So we'll talk about that in just a second, but in general, an individual begins to adopt the desires, motives, attitudes, and drives of other members of the group. And it's the perception of others of the outcomes and whether you are producing those outcomes that gives you legitimacy within the group. So for example, for social learning theory, criminal behavior is learned. It is a byproduct of interacting with others, and that the learning has to occur in groups that you have some intimate relationship with. It just can't be a casual group. By participating in the group, you begin to assimilate techniques, motives, drives, and attitudes of the group. And the direction of those motives, drives, and attitudes is related to the perception of others of whether you are participating in producing the same outcomes that they're intending to produce. So, for example, if you are with a delinquent peer group and you're flaunting opposition to authority or exhibiting disdain for authority or rule making or you wanting to establish independence, if so long as you're behaving consistent with those drives, attitudes, and motives, then you will be essentially seen as an important and valued member of the group. Social control theory, on the other hand, maintains that all people have the potential to be law violators. So notice what's different here. Instead of looking at why people commit crimes, social control theory looks in large part at why people obey the rules. That is, why do people not become lawbreakers? By understanding why people don't become lawbreakers, the focus is on conformity and not law breaking. By focusing on law-abiding decision-making, Travis Hirschi, who is one of the most well-known social control theorists, has argued that self-control is really important to this notion of conformity. That is, he defines self-control as a strong moral sense that renders a person incapable of hurting others or violating social norms. The commitment to conformity speaks to that strong personal investment in conventional institutions, maybe individuals and processes that prevent lawbreaking and jeopardizing one's reputation or stake in life. So think about that for just a second with regard to Santos and whether or not he exhibited what Hirschi would say was self-control, and whether he had that commitment to conformity or not. in reading the prologue where he begins to, or the introduction, I'm sorry, where he begins to discuss how he ended up in prison, ask yourself whether or not he appears there to have good self-control, that is, that strong moral sense, and whether he appears to demonstrate a personal investment in conventional institutions. And if he does, how long does it last? And when does he begin to break from that? Contemporary social control theory, as noted by Travis Hershey and Michael Gottfredson, focuses on the influence of social bonds. So think about this in terms of its relationship to conformity, if you will. So they talk about four types of social bonds: attachment to family, friends, community; commitment to future career success and goals; belief in honesty, morality, fairness, and responsibility; and involvement in school, sports, religion, and social areas. As you begin to think about analyzing the questions that I'll be posing for your readings analysis too, begin to really scrutinize the introduction of the book and Michael Santos's explanation of the shift that occurred for him as he began to shift where his attachments were, who his commitments were to, what his beliefs were, and what his involvement was in. Now, it would be easy to just say, oh yeah, that social control theory explains everything that Santos went through and all of his decision making. But if you think about bonds, for example, if it's our social bonds that keep us from offending, because remember that social control theory looks at why people don't offend, then what happens if, as in the case, I believe, of Michael Santos, your social bonds actually bond you closer to your delinquent friends than they do to your family, to your coworkers, to your teachers? Okay, so what happens when you begin to bond with people that are also of the same belief system or the same mindset as you are with regard to criminality? That is, what if you bond with people who have the same moral sense? Now, Hershey argues that commitment to career, for example, and economic success reduces criminality. What happened to Michael Santos here that changed for him, if in fact it did? So there's a little bit of trouble here with the commitment to failure, because failure to achieve also puts people at risk. So think about that for just a second with the bonds. If people have career and economic success, then that reduces criminality. But people may have commitment but fail to achieve, and that also puts them at risk for failure and for establishing delinquent peer groups. What if in bonding and experiencing a failure to achieve, what if attachment happens to be to a deviant peer group? Or if you have deviant parents, then what happens? Involvement versus supervision reminds me that there are people who are, quote, involved with their kids, but who do not have very good supervision of their kids. So in talking about delinquency and moving away from, let's say, law-abiding behavior to law-breaking behavior, ask yourself if there's enough there in chapter 1 from, or the introduction of Michael Santos's book, to see whether or not there's an explanation for what might have happened there, if anything. The role of deviant peers and parents we talked about, and then this notion of a mistaken causal order. There is some notion that weakened social bonds lead to delinquency. Okay, so think about that for just a second. So you're not tight with your parents, you're not tight with your cousins anymore, family becomes irrelevant, and you happen to get involved with a delinquent peer group. Hershey would argue that those weakened social bonds with an appropriate family or peer group can lead to delinquency and criminality. But it might be criminality that actually leads to the weakened bonds. That is, it's a lot harder to bond with your kids if they're busy engaging in delinquent behaviors. So when you think about an explanation, and here we've just scratched the surface of criminal theories, and if you were in my criminology class, we would have spent 16 entire weeks talking about theories of criminology. But as you begin to consider Santos and why he might have done what he did, think about some of the aspects of these major theories that we've talked about and see if you can come to some defended conclusion about how you think his criminality began. And as you think about how it began, begin to think about how it ended. What happened to him when he was in prison? What happened to him before he was sentenced? What happened to him as he moved from prison to prison to prison? What happened to him as he began to experience really the ravages of the kind of treatment that you get behind bars, regardless of who you are or what you've done or what you may not have done? Because the way you're treated in prison has more to do with people's perceptions of you than it has to do with what you're actually doing or who you actually are. So consider those things as you answer the questions. And if you have questions about that or comments that you want to share about that, bring those to class with you when we meet face to face on the 19th. Okay, I look forward to seeing you then, and make sure to get your media reports in tonight and bring any questions with you to class next week. Those of you who didn't present the first time will present this second time for your media reports. As always, you can message me with questions or comments. Have a great week. I'll see you next Monday live and in person.